Uh, Thank you, Shannon, and thank you to everybody for taking time out of your evening to learn a little bit about the Environmental Voter Project and a lot about environmental voters in Louisiana. We're really, really excited to have this conversation with you. As Shannon mentioned, my name is Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project, and I am going to start by sharing my screen here. All right. So this is what tonight is going to look like. We're going to start with a very quick introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. My apologies to those of you who are already familiar with our work, that you have to hear this intro again. I also offer my apologies to those of you who are not familiar with our work, because what I am not going to be doing is going into in-depth detail on every aspect of our work at the Environmental Voter Project. That is not the purpose of this webinar. This webinar focuses in on the voter data that we've done from our research and predictive modeling in Louisiana and some opportunities to mobilize those voters. That being said, I will do a brief overview of what we do at the Environmental Voter Project, how we do it, and why we do it, and some of our results. But then I'm going to go right to the core of this evening's presentation, and that is a discussion of our recent predictive modeling data that has allowed us to see how many non-voting or infrequently voting environmentalists there are in Louisiana. We also have some interesting demographic data about them, some geographic data about them. And then, of course, for those of you who don't already know, what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is use this data to turn non-voting environmentalists into consistently voting environmentalists. So we're also going to talk about some of the opportunities for people to volunteer or otherwise support our work in Louisiana. And then, as Shannon mentioned, we will close with a Q&A session. So if you do have questions, please put them not in the chat, but rather in the Q&A folder down there, and either Shannon will answer them or I will in the Q&A session. The final thing I'll just say before we jump in and get started is, the Environmental Voter Project is now in 19 states. We expanded into Louisiana a few months ago, almost immediately started mobilizing voters in some special House district races and runoffs. And we have just been so excited and overwhelmed with the number of groups who have reacted positively to us working in Louisiana, who have reached out to us to learn more. And in fact, the reason we are having this event today is because so many groups wanted to learn more about our research and our work and how to partner with each other. So, although I'll mention at the end, I mention this again at the end, I want all of you to keep in your heads that if you are interested in working with us in any way to mobilize these voters, we want to hear from you. Even if you're just interested in some of this research or data that we might be able to share with you, we would love to do that. So please, please do reach out. Okay, we're 6 minutes into the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. In a nutshell, the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that is just laser focused on two things. And that is identifying non-voting environmentalists and then turning them into consistent voters. That's it. Just those two things. We find environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into consistent voters. So when you're thinking about us, I think it's also important to understand what this means we don't do. Because we are laser focused just on these two things, that means that we do not do a lot of the stuff that maybe you're used to environmental nonprofits doing. For instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. As odd as it might sound, we don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or clean air or clean water or other environmental issues. In fact, a good way to think about us is we're not even in the mind-changing or opinion-changing game at all. Instead, we're purely focused on behavior change. What we are trying to do is bypass the messy, expensive stuff of politics, which is convincing people to change their minds or to care more about a particular issue. We don't want to do that. It's important, but it's really hard and really expensive. Instead, we find the people who are already there, the people who care so much about climate or other environmental issues that it's their number one priority, yet they aren't voting. And so what these people need is not issue education, not persuasion messaging, but rather mobilization. They need behavior change messaging. And so that's what we do. We're essentially a full-time, year-round field campaign that uses data science to find non-voting environmentalists and then behavioral science-informed messaging to turn them into more consistent voters. Why do we do that? Well, if there's one thing above all else that the climate and the broader environmental movements need, is more political power. And what we have discovered is that one of the easiest, most efficient ways to get that political power is to take advantage of all of these non-voting environmentalists. And when I say all of these, I really mean it. We don't have the time today because it's not an intro to the Environmental Voter Project to get into the research underlying these numbers. But take a look at how many non-voting environmentalists there are. In the 2020 presidential election, over 8 million already registered voters, they were already registered to vote, who have a high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their number one priority, didn't vote. They just didn't cast ballots. And obviously, because midterm turnout is even lower, so you have even more non-voters, well, in last fall's midterm elections, we think the number is north of 13 million. Now, I say we think because there's still some states that, believe it or not, haven't updated and released their voter files. So we don't have full vote history for all 50 states. But it looks like that number is going to be north of 13 million. 13 million already registered super environmentalists who just didn't show up to vote for an extraordinarily important midterm election. Now, you can look at numbers like this and be frustrated. Believe me, I am every now and then. But we also recognize this to be an extraordinary opportunity, because what these huge populations of non-voting environmentalists represent is a whole bunch of people who don't need their minds changed. They just need their behavior changed. And we live in a moment in time where it's become almost impossible to change people's opinions, to change their minds about anything political, especially climate change. But these people don't need their minds changed. They need their behavior changed. And I won't claim that's easy. Of course it's not. But it is easier and it is cheaper. And perhaps most importantly, because of public voting histories, you can measure what messages work and don't work when it comes to turning non-voters into voters. And then you can iterate and reiterate and double down on the messaging that is best at boosting turnout. And so it gets easier and easier to turn these non-voters into voters. The way that we do it is a 4-step process. And again, forgive me for going through this very quickly. You're all here to hear about Louisiana, not necessarily about everything that we do at EVP. First, identification. We work with data scientists to build predictive models on voter files. What these are very sophisticated individual targeting tools that allow us to assign a score to every single voter in a voter file, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their number one priority over all others. Then, because whether you vote or not is public record, it's very easy for us to take that group of people who are super environmentalists and get rid of all the good voters and just focus on the ones who need this behavioral intervention. That's when we go to step 2 here, mobilization. We now have over 6,000 volunteers around the country who canvass call and send postcards to these voters. And then we as a staff do digital ads and direct mail, all using behavioral science informed messaging that is laser focused and optimized to just do one thing. And that is turn these non-voters into new voters, and then those new voters into consistent voters. And here's the really interesting thing. Because in this first identification step, we were able to isolate people who cared so much about climate and the environment that it was their number one priority. That means that our messaging, the messaging that we use over here in step 2, we have the luxury of saying pretty much whatever we want. We can be completely agnostic with our messaging because we no longer need to do issue education. We no longer need to convince these people to care about something that's already their number one priority. Hell, we could talk about chocolate chip cookies if it was the best way to get these people to vote. And what that does is it opens up an entire universe of different types of behavioral psychology tools that we can use to get these non-voting super environmentalists to vote. All right, third step, habit reinforcement. What we care most about and what we are best at is building long-term consistent power in the electorate. We are not an organization that just hops from big election to big election trying to help X candidate or Y candidate win. That is not what we do. Instead of winning elections, what we're focused on is winning the electorate, of dramatically increasing the number of environmentalists who vote and vote consistently. And because of that, we take habit reinforcement very seriously. We have already, just in 2023, been active in 114 different elections. Not because all of them were important for environmental policymaking. In fact, most of them weren't. But because all of them were important as behavioral intervention opportunities. The only way to turn a non-voter into a voter is to get them to vote in an election. And so our philosophy is, how dare we let one of those election opportunities pass us by? We are in the behavior changing business, and you don't need to be a behavioral scientist to understand that you can't make habitual voters if you only talk to people once every 2 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. And so we take this habit reinforcement in year-round work very, very seriously. And that's ultimately how we end up at step 4, changing the electorate. We know that even in this hyper-partisan moment in time, there is still one thing that unites all Democrats and Republicans, and that is, boy, do they both like to win elections. I don't care whether you're in a Democratic primary or whether you're a Democrat going against a Republican. What you are in the business of as a candidate campaign is collecting enough votes to win. And nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. So what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we just try to get as many environmentalists into that group of consistent voters as possible, knowing that the more we stuff the electorate with environmental voters, the more likely it is that environmental leaders will get elected, but also no matter who gets elected, they will be able to then spend their political capital on the issues that we care about. Because as all of you know, even when we elect the so-called right person, it isn't like they can just snap their fingers and do whatever they want. They need to figure out what to spend their political capital on. And surprise, surprise, they're not going to do it on the thing that non-voters care about. They're going to do it on the thing that voters care about. All right, if you want to learn more about our work in these 19 states, and don't worry, you'll see the 19 states again, and any of the other stuff that I just quickly breezed over, you can go to environmentalvoter.org/about. Very briefly, some of our results. Just last year in 2022, we mobilized voters in hundreds of elections. We made millions of voter contacts over multiple channels. We're confident that we increased turnout in hundreds of elections, but we know for a fact that in randomized control trials, we could prove that we were solely responsible, while controlling for all outside variables, we were solely responsible for increasing turnout. as much as 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and as much as 1.8 percentage points in statewide general elections. And we know this because before we contacted anybody, we set aside a control group of low propensity environmental voters who we never spoke to. And then after the election, when voter files were updated, we could compare turnout among the people we did contact against the low propensity environmental voters in our control group. And these are big numbers. Ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1.9% is in Arizona. He'll let you know. We're very, very proud of this work. Finally, on a cumulative level, we've now been working for almost 7 years. We have contacted north of 9.5 million unique environmental voters, all of whom were unlikely to vote in an election, or else we wouldn't have reached out to them. And as of 2 months ago, almost 1.5 million of them had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and their most recent local election. This is the metric we are most proud of, because this gets to our ultimate goal, which is changing the electorate. Now, to be clear, this doesn't have the same level of scientific rigor as the previous metric, the randomized control trial. I can't claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.5 million non-voters into super voters, but we're pretty darn responsible. There's no other group that's been active in now 1,900 elections over the last 6 years, 7 years. All these dinky little races turning these non-voters into consistent voters. I'm going to breeze over the contextual example slide because I want to get into Louisiana, but just to give you an idea of how big these cumulative numbers are, well, we've made 110,000 or helped make 110,000 super voters in Arizona. That's almost 10 times the size of the presidential margin in 2020 in Arizona. Over 5 times the margin of the gubernatorial. This work ends up making a big difference. If you want to learn more about our results, we've got tons of randomized control trial results at environmentalvoter.org/results. All right, let's get into Louisiana. That's what you folks are here for. A few months ago, as I mentioned, we expanded from 17 states into 2 new states. So now we're working in 19 states. One of those 2 states that we expanded into a few months ago rather, was Louisiana. Before I jump into the data about Louisiana, I just want to go over 3 important notes on the data and terminology. First, voter files track sex data rather than gender data. Because sex data is not analogous to gender, just note that whenever you see male or female or men or women, we are talking about sex data, not gender data, because that's not tracked in most voter files. Similarly, the racial group nomenclature that you'll see will be antiquated, I guess is a good way to put it. You'll see things like Caucasian and Asian, and these are the terms used by voter file companies and by most states when collecting demographic data about voters. Because what we are most interested in is precision when presenting this data, we are going to use the same terminology, especially because these terms are not always analogous. Hispanic is not always perfectly analogous to Latinx. Asian is analogous to AAPI, but it's not always analogous to Asian American, Native, Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander. And so we just want to be careful about this. And then finally, you'll notice that we have some unknown numbers in some of this data. And that's because voter files often are, they're usually complete, but they do miss some stuff. All right. First, why did the Environmental Voter Project decide to start working in Louisiana a few months ago? First, it is the heart of the fossil fuel industry. And this is where, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, it's where people are dying. It is ground zero for every major environmental crisis that humanity is facing in the United States. whether it be environmental racism or air pollution or toxic water or sea level rise or extreme weather. This is where the problem is, and this is where the environmental movement needs to build political power the most. This is where the stakes are the highest. Also, there are lots of opportunities to talk to voters. We are very proud of the great results that we get, but we're also mindful of the fact that only part of those good results are because we do all these experiments and we're smart and we test good messages. A lot of it just comes from repetition. And so it's really hard for us to get good results in states that don't have odd year elections or don't have many even year elections. Louisiana, and the Louisianans on the call don't need me to tell them this, has a ton of elections. Every odd year, every even year, oftentimes they go to runoffs. There are a lot of opportunities to talk to voters. That might be a pain in the butt if you're a voter or you work on campaigns, but if you're in the behavior change business, that is good, that is key. Louisiana also has, with their Public Service Commission, elected utility regulators. That is obviously a very high leverage point of sort of political power that we can work for. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, Louisiana has an enormous number of non-voting and seldom voting environmentalists. We at the Environmental Voter Project like to have big fat denominators, right? Like if you're increasing turnout 1 or 2 percentage points in each election, that's nice, but if you're only talking to 20 voters, who cares? That's not going to change anything. If we really want to change policymaking at the local, state, and federal level, we want to have lots of targets. That's where we can have our biggest impact. And as you'll see in this data, there are lots of non and seldom voting environmentalists in Louisiana. All right, so this is what I mean. After building these predictive models a few months ago, what we were able to identify is 144,000 already registered voters in Louisiana who have a high likelihood of literally listing climate or other environmental issues as their number one priority over all others. Yet they don't even vote in presidential elections. 144,000. And to give you some context, to give you some relevant denominators for that number, there aren't even 3 million registered voters in Louisiana. And in the 2020 presidential, fewer than 2.2 million voted. So if 2.2 million cast ballots in the 20 presidential election in Louisiana, the fact that there are almost 145,000 registered super environmentalists is saying, no thanks. Well, that's not an inconsequential number. If we then move to super environmentalists who don't vote in gubernatorial elections, and as I think everybody on this call knows, there is a gubernatorial election, an open gubernatorial election in Louisiana this year. Well, last time there was a gubernatorial, 1.5 million ballots were cast. We identified 320,000 already registered super environmentalists who have never voted in a gubernatorial election before in Louisiana or an election of lower turnout. So these are pure turnout targets for this year, for 2023. And because we're not talking about polls, we're talking about individualized targeting techniques here. We literally know who these people are by name and street address. We often have their phone numbers. These are the people who we are going to be targeting this year. And these are the people we're going to be targeting next year. All right, who are these people? What are some of the demographic information about them? Well, first, as probably comes as no surprise, actually, before I get into the data, let me just explain this chart at the bottom here. In this column, in this row here, you see EVP targets. These are the percentages of people who are low propensity environmental voters, in particular, or perhaps more precisely, people who don't vote in gubernatorial elections who are environmentalists. Down here at the bottom, that is the baseline of all registered voters. So these environmentalists up here are registered to vote, but I wanted to give you something to compare it to. We wanted to give you a comparison point. So we've put in that baseline registration number. And so the way to read this is 18 to 24-year-olds. Well, 18 to 24-year-olds make up 8.2% of registered voters in Louisiana, but they make up 33.4% of these unlikely to vote super environmentalists. You'll see 37.7% of these unlikely to vote super environmentalists are in that 25 to 34 range. So that's the first thing that we can say. Surprise, surprise, these non-voting super environmentalists are disproportionately young. My guess is that comes as no surprise to many of you. What I would like to point out in these age demographic breakdowns, though, is over here, the 65 and up. It is no longer as simple as saying, the younger you are, the more likely you are to care about climate and the environment. No, it's not that simple. We see this kind of dip in all of our states, or almost all of our states, not in places like Alaska, maybe less so in Maine, but in almost all of our states. Yes, young people through the roof. Huge majorities of them care deeply about climate and the environment. Then you get to 30s, 40s, 50s, almost nobody lists it as their top priority. But then something weird happens and it starts going back up again. And, we kind of like jokingly refer to it as like the grandmother effect, because usually it's women rather than men in this age group. But people over the age of 65, a whole bunch of them now list climate and the environment as their top priority, such that we see this kind of swoosh trend in that age demographic data in all of our states, and we're certainly seeing it in Louisiana. All right, the sex numbers here. There is a gender gap. I'll use the terminology gender gap, but again, just understand this is sex data, not gender data. There is a gender gap where women pretty dramatically outnumber men among these low propensity environmental voters. But you'll see when you compare it to all registered voters, it's actually not that different from the underlying gender gap that exists among all registered voters. There are 10% more women registered to vote in Louisiana than men. And so the fact that there are 12% more low propensity environmental voters who are women than men, that's not that big a deal. We actually see a much more dramatic gender gap between low propensity environmental voters and registered voters in other states. All right, some of the racial data breakdown that we're seeing. If you look at all registered voters in Louisiana, there are twice as many white voters as there are Black voters. If you look at these environment first voters, it totally flips. It completely flips, so that among these low propensity environmental voters, there are actually twice as many Black voters as there are white voters. This does mirror what we see in a lot of states, which is that the modern environmental movement is no longer a white suburban sort of yuppie group. Honestly, I'm not sure it ever was, but if it was, it certainly isn't anymore. This is a coalition of young people and people of color. Now, in other states, often it's AAPI voters that really pop, and then Black voters second to AAPI voters when we're looking at these low propensity environmental voters. And so Louisiana is a little bit different in that way, but still, this is, I think, pretty noteworthy and important for people who care about building political power in the environmental movement, not just in Louisiana, but anywhere, to recognize that this is a coalition of people of color, disproportionately so. All right, we've given a little bit of demographic data on age and sex and race. I want to get into some income data here as well. Voter files don't give a whole bunch of income bracket information. Really, the only thing they give is who are the people who we think make over $100,000 a year, which is kind of a weird number to choose as like your cutoff point, but I guess it's a round number. So that's all we've got. But we did think that it was useful because what this also showed, and again, this is something that we're seeing in other states as well, but it's more dramatic in Louisiana, is these low propensity environmental voters are not only disproportionately young, they are not only disproportionately people of color, but they are also disproportionately lower income. Now, I'm not going to use the term low income when talking about people who make less than $100,000. That's kind of crazy. This is the only data point we have. But what I can tell you is even where we have other data points in different income buckets, we see that trend. We see that this group is disproportionately lower income. But with this particular data point that you'll see here, the way to read this chart is, okay, over here, when we look at all registered voters in Louisiana, 8.8% of them make over $100,000 a year. When we look at all of the environment first voters we've identified in Louisiana, only 3.5% of them make over 100 grand a year. All right, now let's layer on vote propensity. So let's look at all the people who are unlikely to vote in 2023 in Louisiana. And we say unlikely to vote because we look at their vote histories and we think, oh, they might not show up. 5.2% of them make over 100 grand a year. So even if we're not worrying about environmentalists versus non-environmentalists, obviously people who are less likely to vote tend to be lower income. Again, though, even among those people who are unlikely to vote this year, the environmentalists, there are far, far fewer of them who make more than 100 grand a year than the non-environmentalists, or rather than the baseline of all registered voters. And then you'll see in 2024, the numbers are smaller, but you still have that pretty dramatic comparison. And so all taken together, this demographic data tells us, yes, these environment-first registered voters in Louisiana are disproportionately young, although there is that group of 65 and up. They are disproportionately people of color, in particular, Black voters. And they certainly disproportionately make less than $100,000 a year. And again, I recognize that's kind of a weird cutoff, but it's what we've got data-wise. All right, where do they live? Just focusing on, for the next few slides, when we're talking about location, we're going to focus on this group of super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote this year. Although I can tell you these heat maps, these distribution maps, wouldn't look dramatically different if instead we were looking at people who are unlikely to vote next year, okay? But what you're looking at here is people who are unlikely to vote this year. You can see a distribution of where they are. You know, this is maybe prettier than it is helpful. Obviously, a lot of this data just tracks where population centers are, but this is where they are. All right, drilling down on some parishes here. You can see in East Baton Rouge Parish, we identified over 41,000 already registered super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote this year. And this is a distribution of where we see concentrations of them. In Caddo Parish, 18,447. In Orleans Parish, almost 70,000. And again, I want to be clear, these folks are already registered. They're already registered to vote. They are very, very likely to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally listed as their #1 priority. Yet we can see from previous vote history that they're unlikely to vote this year. These are our targets at the Environmental Voter Project. You can see Jefferson Parish, almost 28,000. Lafayette Parish, not quite as dense, a little bit more spread out, those 15,000 in Lafayette Parish. And then St. Tammany Parish threw in there as well, just to give you an idea of where some of these distributions are. All right, final thing is, and I'm mindful of the fact that a lot of people on this call probably know more about the political lay of the land than I do or we do, but just to give you a sense of what we're looking at this fall, this is the first election where there are these newly drawn state legislative districts, but the way things currently stand in Louisiana is in the state house and in the state Senate, Republicans have veto proof, or they can override the governor's vetoes, but just barely, slim majorities. So I don't want to mislead anybody on this call into thinking like that partisan control of either state house is up for grabs. It likely isn't, but there are still a lot of important things at stake here, not to mention dealing with all of the local election and local level policies and federal level policies. If we drill down on congressional districts, Louisiana is one of the most grossly gerrymandered states in the country. And if you look at the partisan leans of these congressional districts, you can see compared to the overall national average, we're looking at districts that are 20 points more Republican or 20 points more Democrat. The closest one, LA4, is like a 14-point spread. Like that's big. These are really heavily gerrymandered districts. In fact, they are so grossly gerrymandered and so grossly gerrymandered in a way that at least 5-10 years ago, the Supreme Court would have said it violates the Voting Rights Act, that there is a case that will likely be decided in the coming months, Merrill v. Milligan, where the Supreme Court might, certainly ain't holding my breath, but they might decide that these districts need to be thrown out and redrawn. I think it's unlikely, but it is certainly possible that they'll decide that this impermissibly violates the Voting Rights Act. But as we look at it, this is the lay of the land on the congressional districts, and you can see these are now 2024 numbers because obviously this year isn't a congressional election year. This is the number of targets we believe, this is the number of targets we currently have for environmentalists who are unlikely to vote in a presidential election year. And so you can see we've got some pretty high concentrations, obviously in the second, which is this district here, that pretty much almost perfectly maps Cancer Alley. It should come as no surprise that all of these super environmentalists happen to be the people who are living with toxic air and toxic water each day of their lives. And they are also packed into a congressional district. And so they are not just dealing with environmental racism, but they're dealing with having a lot of the power of their vote diluted. That being said, we do have pretty large numbers in some other districts as well. And you can see that there. All right, we'll get to the Q&A, but before we do that, I do just want to say this year, and we're so grateful to all of the groups that we're already working with. We've already been active in sort of the HD 93 elections, but all of the groups that have already reached out to us, and we're planning phone banks together and all that, but we would love to work with more people, either as groups or as individuals. And this is what we see in the coming months. First off, right now, there are no elections about to happen. So right now, as we speak, we are not calling or mailing or sending digital ads to Louisianans. But we are doing that into other states. And so if you want to dip your toe in the water and get used to what it's like to volunteer for the Environmental Voter Project, you can go to our website, environmentalvoter.org/get-involved, and we'll put the link in the chat, and see what it's like. But what I can say is that once September does come, we will get right up and going in having regularly scheduled phone banks, both for the October 14th primary election, but then also for the November election. Those phone banks will be open to anybody who wants to just sign up on our website. But what we are also happy to do is talk to your group about setting up phone banks just for you. Finally, once you've been trained on how to do phone banks with us, and it's not hard, You can also just get the credentials from us and make calls whenever you want. It's very, very, very easy. Now, although we also do door-to-door canvassing and postcarding, we are not going to be doing either in Louisiana this fall. We only have door-to-door canvassing in a few cities, and because we just expanded into Louisiana, we didn't think it was appropriate to try to go from 0 to 60 just like that. And although we will be doing some postcarding campaigns this fall, it is not likely that Louisiana will be one of them for a whole bunch of different reasons. Not because it's unimportant, it is enormously important. But we will be doing tons of these phone banks. What we will also be doing for the October elections, but it is funding dependent, is doing direct mail campaigns to these unlikely to vote environmentalists. And we know from our campaigns, we can boost turnout 2, 3, sometimes 4 percentage points with these direct mail pieces. And then certainly in the general election or runoff that's likely to happen, we will again continue to be doing phone banks. We will have direct mail. We will also have digital ads, but it is all funding dependent. And we're going to be making those decisions, those budgeting decisions over the coming months. What does this mean for funders and what does this mean for potential volunteers? First off, please go to that link, environmentalvoter.org/get-involved. If you are interested either in talking to us about setting up phone banks for your group or interested in just joining our phone banks and mobilizing these voters, we make it so easy. We give you a script that we know from previous randomized control trials is proven to increase turnout. 2, donate. This stuff takes money. We are a nonprofit. We work with really thin margins. No one is getting rich doing this work, believe me, but it does take money. And over the next few months, this is when we will be building our budget for Louisiana. And then finally, if you are interested in finding out a little bit more about our plans and you want to speak to us either about hosting an event like this or hosting phone banks or what it is like to fund EVP, please, please do reach out to us. You can reach out to Shannon, who's putting information in the chat. You can reach out to me, Nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org. We are confident that we can make a big, big difference in Louisiana over the coming years. But we also know what we do well and what we don't do well. And I believe that we have the requisite humility and sort of the Socratic ignorance to walk into situations and want to be voracious learners. And so we want to talk to you and talk to your organizations and see if there are ways we can help you with our data. See if there are ways that we can partner with each other. See if we can learn from you and see if you can learn from us. We really, really are excited about making this work. And we're also just so grateful that people keep on reaching out to us for events like this. So that's it. That's all the data. And now we can get into the Q&A. So thank you all. And Shannon, what do we have here?
Yeah, a good question right off the top. I know you touched on
Shannon,
this.
I can't hear you. Oh, there we go.
Ooh, great. I know you touched on this a little bit, but how do we determine who is an environmentalist? Like what criteria are we using?
Really, really great question. And so, yes, I did just breeze over this because this is one of those things that we could spend a lot of time on, and I really wanted to get to the Louisiana data. The technique we use is something called predictive modeling. And before I describe it to you, I just want to say this is how sophisticated political campaigns now target voters. So any of the presidential campaigns that are getting up and running, the gubernatorial campaigns, recent Senate and congressional campaigns, this is now how sophisticated political groups target voters. And it happens this way. We start by polling tens of thousands of people, huge, huge numbers of people. But we can get away with doing that cost-wise because it's a really short poll. We're only asking one question. We're just saying, what's your number one most important political priority? And let's say in a state like Louisiana, 500 or 1,000 people say, oh yeah, climate change, clean air, clean water, environmental justice, some environmental issue. Well, then what we're able to do is work with data scientists to figure out, okay, what do we know about these 1,000 people who just told us that climate is their number one priority? What data is there on voter files? What census data is available on them? What publicly available behavioral or consumer data is there on them? We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot out there. And we can start seeing some interesting patterns and correlations. We can say, okay, well, these 1,000 people who just told us, these 1,000 Louisianans who just told us that climate's their top priority, there are a whole bunch of them who live within 5 miles of an urban core. Okay, that's really interesting. I'm just using these as examples. And a whole lot of them recently bought a hybrid vehicle or an electric vehicle. Oh, okay, well, that's really interesting. Oh, and huge majorities of them send their kids to public schools or parochial schools rather than non-parochial private schools. Oh, that's a really interesting data point. Oh, look, and a whole bunch of them subscribe to exercise magazines or this, that. There are all of these like weird little predictive data points that we start pulling out. And it's a long iterative process. But at the end of it, what we're able to do is build a whole set of scores and literally give every individual voter in the Louisiana voter file a score from 0 to 100, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their number one priority over all other issues. And we've done that. Every single Louisiana voter we've assigned a score to. And at the end of this long iterative process, when these data scientists that we work with end up building these scores, we then test those scores and retest them and retest them. Because again, we obviously didn't talk to all 3 million registered voters in Louisiana. No one can do that. We talked to a smaller number of them, about 10,000, isolated the 1,000 of them who listed climate and the environment as their top priority, and then tried to extrapolate from that to find other people like them. And at the end of that, what we do is we just find those people who have really high probability scores, usually like 85% or higher likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their top priority. And then those are the people we target. But to be clear, this is a probabilistic model. We obviously have not spoken to every single individual in Louisiana. No one could do something like that. But what we also know is that these probability scores are frighteningly accurate. I mean, when we test the accuracy of these models in the past, what we've done is we've said, okay, here's the top 15%. So people with an 85 score or above. Send them out to an outside polling company who's not related to the data scientists we used. And we say, hey, can you just call these people and ask them one question? Just say, hey, what's your number one most important political priority? And every time we've done that, at least 85% of the respondents have said, oh, climate change, why do you ask? That's how accurate these targeting techniques are. And not because we're particularly good or bad at it, we're the same as everybody else is. This is just the level to which this targeting technique has arrived. And this is how we're able to identify individuals on voter files, not large demographic groups, but literal individuals, and say, okay, let's go after Marianne Smith at 123 Main Street because she's got a 90% likelihood of listing climate as her top priority, and we know she's never voted in a gubernatorial election. Let's go get her with our nonpartisan but proven turnout messaging. And that's how we do it.
Awesome. All right, next question. I'm not sure if you have this off the top of your head, Nathaniel, but do you have a sense of how many total environmentalists we have in Louisiana? Not just the non-voting ones, but kind of the general number?
Great question. I remember let's put it this way. In most of our states, I actually think in all of our states, environmentalists are disproportionately poor voters. Now, what it means to be a non-voter obviously changes from election to election, right? There are more non-voters in 2023 than there will be in 2024. But I remember being particularly surprised by how lopsided that was in Louisiana. So my guess is going to be, if we identified about 320,000 super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote in this year's gubernatorial, I think we identified about 400, maybe 410,000 super environmentalists, period, among all registered voters. We don't bother with unregistered voters. Registering voters is a whole different kettle of fish, and we think this is much, much higher leverage. So that's my guess. Whoever asked that question, we can figure out the answer for sure and let you know, though. It's a great question.
Perfect. And this one might be a little bit more specific, but someone asked a question around whether we have any initial thoughts about whether like eliminating ERIC, or for those that aren't familiar, this like shared voter database among states, would impact our work at EVP.
Yeah, so ERIC is essentially a shared voter database and a system for states to quickly share data about people who are newly registered in their state. Now, the states pretty much have to share that data anyway, but ERIC makes it under the Help America Vote Act, which is, I don't know how old that is now. But what ERIC does is it essentially, it like greases the machine, it oils the machine so that different states know if someone has moved and just registered in a new state or something like that. And it is, so when you hear about states dropping out of this system, I guess I'll say a few things. One, they really never have a good reason to drop out of it, at least that I'm aware of. They're just doing it to kind of like troll people online and score stupid political points and things like that. Like, this is something that helps any state run efficient elections, whether you are a deep red state or a deep blue state or a purple state. But there is no doubt that if states drop out of this information sharing system, instead of having grease in the system or oil in the system, you're throwing sand in the system. You're throwing sand in the gears, and it makes it a little bit clunkier. And that impacts everybody who is in the voter contact or mobilization business. I would say that it impacts us a little bit more just because the environmental movement is so disproportionately young, and young people are more likely to move between states than middle-aged and older people are. So yes, there is certainly a scenario that I could imagine where if one of our targets in Louisiana moved to Florida, say another environmental voter project state, another state that we work in, they might fall through the cracks for longer than they otherwise would have because states are dropping out of this system. That's a problem. It's a problem for organizations like us. It's also a problem for election workers, these poor election workers who are taking like so much time out of their day to do a thankless task, not to mention now get like death threats. And like information like this helps them do their jobs well. So it's a shame that that states are pulling out of it. It won't impact us much, but it will impact a little bit.
All right, last question, which is pretty perfect, and I think we'll get you into what you're about to say next, Nathaniel. The next elections in Louisiana are not until October, followed by mid-November. What can people do today?
Great question. And we're getting towards the end, so I think this has to be the last question. So as far as stuff that folks can do today, first off, if you are interested in volunteering to contact voters with us in Louisiana, go to that volunteer sign up link right now. Right now. for two reasons. One, you can start practicing. You can mobilize voters in other states. We've got elections coming up in Georgia and Virginia and Arizona and Kansas and Maine. I'm sure I'm forgetting some others. Why not turn out non-voting environmentalists elsewhere? But even if you don't care about those other states, what signing up for that will help you do is, one, get immediately notified once we do start contacting voters in Louisiana. But two, if you get trained on contacting these voters now, you will then be able to call Louisianans or people in other states whenever you want. You won't have to log onto a phone bank. You can just sit on your couch, watch TV, and be dialing these folks with our tested script. So that's the first thing that you can do now. The second thing, and I'm not going to apologize for asking for donations. What we do works. And as creepy as it sounds, I'll say it. We know who our targets are by name and street address. We know who these non-voting environmentalists are. We've run hundreds of randomized control trials telling us which interventions turn these non-voters into new voters. The only thing we need are more volunteers, more groups to work with and help, and more money. More money to run these phone banks, to do direct mail, and to do digital ads. So please, there's a link in the chat. Please click on it. We all know what happens with these Zoom webinars, right? Like the thing ends and then you're like, oh my God, where was that link in the chat? Where did that go? Well, if you click on it now, it'll be open. We would love to have your support. You can also make a monthly recurring donation. That is helpful because it allows you to maybe donate a smaller amount each month, but it's also helpful for us because remember, we care about habit reinforcement. We work year round, so it's helpful to get that money year round. And then finally, what I'll just say is, if you are part of an organization that would like to work with us, either by contacting voters, or maybe you do something that isn't perfectly aligned with what we do, but is certainly aligned with our values. Maybe you're an environmental justice organization, or maybe you are a lobbying organization and you're not going to be doing voter turnout, but you'd like to talk to us to see if there's any of our research that might be able to inform you or things like that. We love doing that free of charge. We're not a nonprofit that makes money through consulting fees. We want to be good allies. We want to help you. And our only goal working in Louisiana, just like our only goal working in the other 18 states, is to build up the political power of the environmental movement. So we really mean it when I say, we want you to tell us how we can help you. We really want you to let us know that. All right. We kept you 1 minute after I told you we would. I apologize for that. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I can't believe we had such an enormous audience of people here. This is outstanding news. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you, Shannon. And thank you to all of you who shared this evening with us. And particularly thank you to all the organizations who reached out to us and said, hey, can you host this and tell us a little bit more about your work? Thank you all, and have a great night.